bed sores for healthcare. I think that's really very fascinating stuff. And what's fascinating about it is that it's a kind of an Internet of Things device. So it actually is collecting data on treatment. So that's number one. We have a cancer innovation, impact investing, treatment of hard tumors. That's also coming around. And we also have I know there's been like a huge, just far greater diagnosis of autism than ever before. And as a matter of fact, I think that, there might be some correlation between, autistic behavior and heightened intelligence for a lot of people, especially computer programmers. But I think that we have somebody who's going to be presenting, Joan Fallon from CureMark, is going to be presenting on her enzymatic treatment for autism, which is going through final stages of testing. So really looking forward to that. So we've got some great healthcare speakers here. They've got 45 minutes to speak. So I'm hoping that Dan, you're in sunny South Florida, is that correct?
I am. It's a beautiful 72 degrees today, Marty, and very enjoyable outside.
Thank you. It was sleeting outside last night. And then we have a really great group of speakers, and I'm very happy Eric Singer has joined us at the last minute. Eric has probably one of the best pipelines of healthcare investors that I know of. And he always has fantastic news about what he's doing in the healthcare space. So, so Dan, why don't you take it away, introduce your panel.
Sure.
As your panel gets introduced, I'll end the poll, publish it to you guys, and you guys take a look at it and see, what people are interested in. All righty. And again, getting back to the real estate panel, you weren't able to answer some questions. So if you get a chance, please, jump into chat and answer the questions on chat. All right. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you, Marty. It's nice to be here, and we do have a great panel. And I just want to say one thing based on the previous panel, which I thoroughly enjoyed, is that Florida is a booming. That's the only way to describe it. I don't know about Texas right now because of, unfortunately, the storms, and I hope everyone's safe over there. But Florida is open for business. We welcome you all to come and spend a lot of money. I was talking to David last night, and David and I were discussing that. I expect him to spend a lot of money before he heads home. So with that, I want to introduce our panel. Before I get started, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm Dan Strackman. I run ANC Advisors. We're a strategic consulting and advisory firm to the investment management space. We work primarily with hedge funds and private equity firms on the operations and marketing side. And with that, I want to introduce our panel. I want to start with Darshana Zavari. I hope I said your last name right, Darshana. I know we spoke about your first name yesterday, but Darshana, introduce yourself for a moment.
Sure. Thanks very much, Dan. My name is Darshana Zavari. I'm a managing partner at Catalyst Health Ventures. We are a Boston-based venture capital fund focused on healthcare. And within healthcare, we invest in a subsector that is med tech. And within med tech, it's medical devices, diagnostics, and some digital technologies, particularly digital therapeutics. So we like to focus on sort of therapeutic medical technologies that will, when administered, fundamentally change clinical outcomes for patients. We've been doing this for about 14 years now. And have just started investing out of our new fund that we closed late last year. We're two managing partners. We're a small team. We like to be, generally speaking, the lead or the co-lead investor in deals, take board seats and are pretty active in the companies. And then we're early stage, meaning we like to invest at a stage where we can see the proof of concept of a device or a technology, and then we're okay taking sort of the regulatory and commercial risk, but we want to see the pure science risk taken out before we invest.
Great, thank you. David, can you spend a moment or two telling us a little about you and your fund?
Sure, David Eigen, P5L Ventures. We invest in what I would call platforms, which is a very loosely and overused term, but what I more specifically refer to as closed loop systems, typically have some hardware, do not invest in molecules, invest in digital therapeutics, Again, things that are closed loops so we can learn and get better. We've made investments at the seed stage all the way through B, and now some upcoming C rounds following our companies. A lot more time on AI and machine learning being involved, not again the overused terms, but where they actually really add value. Our basic premise, which I came up with 25 years ago before I became a hedge fund manager for the next 15 years, was that most ambitious and most important goal for a patient, because I came to this as a patient, is you only really want to know what to do at any given moment in time. So whether it's cancer and what treatment you should be getting, what you should be eating, what you should be avoiding, or whether it's something as basic, I call it basic, as type 2 diabetes, which I know Dan has his own opinion on most people that have type 2 diabetes. And again, how do you influence people to change behavior, both the doctors, the practitioners, all the way through the patients themselves. So we've invested in a couple companies. By example, up in Boston, I'm in Connecticut, basically. Usually I'm in Florida at the moment for a couple more days. Several companies in Boston. One is Iterative Scopes, which is doing AI in IBD and cancer, focused on adenomas. They have the best detection rate. A platform for microtomy, which is the bottleneck in pathology of cutting tissue and placing it in slides, and then ultimately that company has a path into understanding what's basically creating triage inside the pathology lab. Converso, which creates patient signals. It started as what I thought years ago as a chatbot for providers, but what it ultimately is a system for generating patient signals and integrating the doctor and triage and a host of other things. They're getting into predictive AI as the company matures. So all those things that, again, integrate the patient, integrate care, and figure out what the patient needs at any given point in time.
Great. Eric?
Thank you. So my name's Eric Singer. I've been an investment banker for a long time now, and I've late in life I came to understand how great tax advantage areas are, particularly real estate and healthcare. The beauty of healthcare is that you have a payment structure where it's deductible to the vast majority of the companies that provide insurance, and not income to the consumers. So if you step back and take a long view of the healthcare industry, its equity has grown at a rate substantially in excess of the rest of the market. My focus is on really smaller companies. And actually, the focus has gotten much tighter in late in life, where I don't feel like I want to work on very many deals a year. What we're looking for is companies that have a substantial breakout possibility with a lot less risk. We're basically a little bit different from the venture community in that, since we're not trying to fill a pipeline and we're not compensated on an AUM. We don't have money burning a hole in our pocket. We go to some small investors, but small but accredited investors, get them very intimate with the story, and they have helped me fund companies for the last 6 years. The first company that I did this with, which I think Marty was referencing, is a company called Neotex. Neotex, when they came to me, it was just a team. It was a Nobel Prize winner, Roger Kornberg, the godfather of chemotherapy, Marcel Rosenzweig, and the CEO that brought them together. We did a search for a failed drug that we thought could be revived, and we have a drug that's called naptumomab, or NAP for short. And what it does is we attach a fragment of Staphylococcus to the surface of tumors, and that makes the body, fools the body into thinking it's fighting a bacterial infection. So you get an outsized response. And one of the earlier speakers referenced that you want to be able to be in a position where you get a platform. We think that this drug will allow us to improve the results in CAR T, checkpoint inhibitor therapy, and and chemotherapy across all the three major cancer therapeutic modalities. I was able to, so far I've been able to raise $78 million for the company. We were able to get Larry Ellison as an investor, Hank Greenberg, Tom Hill, founder of Blackstone, and we will be going to look to the market for more money. We plan on being in 5 phase 2 trials next year. And if somebody's interested in putting a dent in cancer, that's I strongly urge you to give me a call offline. I work with Bradley Woods. In addition, Marty was nice enough to let us present about a company several months ago, which is the name of the company is Petrogen. The CEO is David Kolb, and David is in a unique position. He's been working with Yale for the last 10 years to help them commercialize the intellectual property that they have. And this is a very rich seam to mine over the next 10 years. Yale is a leader in understanding an enzyme called ENPP1 that if you don't have it, if you have too little of it, you get rapid mineralization, and unfortunately the kids who get it have mineralization in their arteries and their heart, and they tend to pass away in their teens. But Yale came out with a company which has gone public and has a market cap today about $600 or $700 million, Inozyme, that where they're trying to boost that enzyme. But Yale realized that if we could actually suppress the enzyme locally around teeth, we could help people have healthy gums. So that's a deal that I'm in the process of right now, and we're raising money at a $15 million valuation. It's the kind of thing that is a little bit too early for the major venture community. One of my colleagues, Dan Ryan, is working on a deal where he's going into the venture community with an imaging company where their valuation is at the $400 million level. I think it's actually possible to find deals that have an outsized chance of success. Normally you might think of a cancer company as having a 10% chance of success, and maybe hopefully you make 10 or 15 times your money. We're looking for companies that we think have a 50% chance of success with that kind of exit. So I've become very discriminating in my old age. I don't want to work that hard. I just want to work on 1 or 2 gems a year if I can.
Great. Thanks, Eric, for that. So I guess the first panel is, we've got a couple polls and we've got a few questions already. So I want to remind everybody that we can, if you have questions for the panel, please shoot them in, and I will try to get to as many as possible. But I guess the question for all 3 of you, and Eric, you touched on this a little bit with some of your explanation of your investments. What are the sectors that are most important for healthcare investing today? Is it biopharma? Is it devices? Is it healthcare IT? Is it services? Is it drugs? What are those, in your guys' opinion, what do you think are the areas that investors should be looking at and focusing on? Darshan, you want to talk a little bit about that? And David, I'd love your opinion, and obviously Eric, yours as well.
Sure, I'm happy to start. I think, Dan, the answer is all of the above. Obviously healthcare is a major sector in the US. We're spending almost 18% of our GDP on healthcare. So there are plenty of problems to solve, and the approaches to solve those problems are going to be very varied and depending on the problem. So I think all of these have a role to play. From our perspective, we think that the drug market or the biopharma market is well served. There are plenty of investors out there that are investing in biotech and new molecules. We also see those as we see drugs as a sector where the pure science risk is very, very high. As Eric pointed out, the chance of success for a drug is 10% or possibly even less. On the other end of the spectrum, there's digital health and healthcare IT, which I also believe is a sector that is well served. There are plenty of venture capitalists that are investing in digital health. It's sort of the new buzzword. We have our own concerns about that sector with, defining revenue models, et cetera. But regardless, it is a sector that has plenty of money going into it. For us, we want to focus on specifically on devices and what we call engineering-based solutions, so mechanical solutions for mechanical problems. And the reason we like this sector is, number one, it's underserved. There are very, very few VCs out there in the US that are actually investing in this very large market opportunity. And there are fewer still who actually know how to do it well. And we believe with our sort of continued dedication to this space for 14 years, we have developed a strategy where we're able to address these issues really effectively. And then as you think about the population and the aging demographic, the types of problems that you start to encounter are very mechanical in nature. So think about your heart. It's a muscle at the end of the day. And so the muscle gets weak over time, and the valves start to fail, and the tissue starts to remodel. And so these are problems in the heart that we call structural in nature. And those types of structural problems cannot be solved with a drug. They cannot be solved with a digital therapeutic. They have to be solved with, with engineering hardcore devices. And so as that population ages, we think those are the types of issues that are going to become more and more prevalent, and bigger market opportunities where with effective devices that are therapeutic in nature, you can fundamentally change the outcome of that, of that patient, or the clinical outcome, and help people live longer, better, higher quality lives. So that's the area that we are focused on. And I'll just add to that and say there are, from an exit and liquidity perspective, there are lots and lots of strategics and med tech companies out there in the US today that are sitting on very large cash reserves. And so this mode of exit that predominantly exists in med tech, which is mergers and acquisitions, is very viable, and it is very active. So we think this is a very, very good time to invest in this underserved sector where we don't see a lot of others play. So that's sort of our perspective on that.
David, how about yourself? I know.
Sorry?
I said, I know you were talking last night about a very cool device to help with therapeutics. So tell us a little bit about your thoughts here.
Well, I probably, there's nothing that Darshana said that I disagree with. There is, I don't find digital health, so to speak, to be, it's crazy crowded in many ways, but it's not crazy crowded with quality. And I believe there will be a significant, like any cycle, you go back to 99, 2000, you're going to have this burnout. In the AI sector, it's one of the most overinvested sectors, and companies are burning money. I believe Page AI raised something like 100 million. Path AI is trying to raise 300 million at $1 billion valuation. They're realizing, from the way I look at what they're doing without knowing this, that their AI, is not going to be as good as they hope. So a lot of this raise is to actually get into the lab business. Because they want to create and control data, so that because the quality of the data isn't there. And so there's just a lot of but if you look at Livongo's success, and I would clarify this between what you see from some young entrepreneurs where they say, and this happened to me recently, someone said, oh, this person's been really successful. They raised a Series B. And I said, what's the revenue of the company? Oh, they don't have any revenue yet. And I said, so where's, they can sell to investors. They can sell hype. I got to see substance. And there's not a lot of that, but you're seeing, a very fundamental step change with due to COVID. Livongo got bought out on paper, at least at 180 times trailing revenue, somewhere between 90 and 100 times forward revenue. Not to take anything away from the company, but that dwarfs the AOL Time Warner merger of insane valuations. And so I believe that we'll have this opportunity to invest in a lot of the carnage. So I don't believe in moving too quickly. But we need to know the most, I think the single most important value in care right now is based around value-based care. So we need to know, we need to have the best information about what to do next for the patient. So for instance, this company called Figure 8 that we led the seed round and we just did a Series A. They have small form devices. It came out of work that the founder developed at the MIT Media Lab. And they can take what is typically a 3-hour session with, it's very complicated to look at your body structure and your, what I would call MSK, so musculoskeletal issues. And they've knocked it down to a couple of minutes with, instead of a $250,000 system with a dedicated person that costs, thousands of dollars for their 3 hours, at least that's how they'll bill it out. It's down to a couple minutes and a technician can do it. That is not even a high paid person. And so right now they have it down to a minute to diagnose whiplash. They can, you can put on, it takes about a minute or two total, couple sensors around your knees, do a simple squat. You can tell ACL tear. And like any technology, they just keep encroaching into all areas of MSK. So now that's before an MRI, that's before, and all those things, and you start to really learn what needs to be done. And that's the most fertile area because you have to justify your expense. And so I would argue that the drug industry is extremely overfunded with rates of return that some estimate is, is under 1%. And so it's very potluck. And it's not to take away from people that can pick drugs. And there are some situations, but for the average investor, it's a very risky place to be. But if you compare that drug, because the issue to me is not, does that drug work 20% of the time? It does it work 100% of the time if you can identify the person that it works on. So, and that is where I believe care, a lot of investors I know that invest in molecules, there's not enough return in diagnostics. I actually, I had a hedge fund for years. And then when I switched, when I started working with a doctor to start P5 about 5 years ago, I was trying to figure out how to explain to my mother what I'm focused on doing. So how do I dumb this down to the most, no offense to her, but about what I'm doing. And she grew up with a kitchen table that had a Lazy Susan on it. And I had seen some footage that had the old videos of those massive media tape, like data banks where you have that robotic arm running around all over. And I said, picture your dining room table over what she has had for 30 plus years. And I said, on one side are all the diagnostics, the other side are all the treatments, services, drugs, doesn't matter what, anything that's treatment, anything that's a diagnostic. And you have this really smart thing sitting in the middle of your Lazy Susan going over to one side. What's the diagnostic to use? Okay, that tells me what I should go back to the treatment. And then I got to go back to the diagnostic and it just whips around back and forth. And so that's where in digital health, where I see a lot of tremendous value because the issue, and I invest in devices, but the issue ultimately is going to be, how do I prove my value? So.
Great. Eric, when you're looking at making investments, and I know you work on a number of deals a year, not a whole lot, but how important are things like intellectual property, opportunity, potential IRR, management, those types of issues when you're looking at deals?
Well, the most important issue is always management because whether it's politic to admit it or not, it happens quite often that you get into a deal with smart management and their original, they go someplace. Neotech started as a company that was going to look for drugs where biomarkers could identify a subset of work. And the more they got into it, the more they became skeptical of their approach, and they shifted gears and went for a drug that had failed. The good old days where you could have a business plan, it was totally coherent, it was never going to be subject to change, and you could bring it out. Those days are gone. Everybody has to have the ability to adjust on the fly. So I think it's kind of a shibboleth, just say that management, but management is really important. Intellectual property is obviously key as well. If you don't have intellectual property, you don't have anything. But intellectual property is not limited to. I find that people sometimes define intellectual property as having patent protection. it's not really necessarily patent protection. In the world of biologics, if you could take a drug that has no patent protection, but it addresses an unmet need, and the FDA will give you, if it's a biologic, you may have 5 or 10 years of marketing exclusivity, which is enough to take care of it. I think the third thing is to just understand that when you are investing in healthcare, particularly with something that potentially has an outlet to the public markets, you're investing in optionality. Okay, so you can have something. At my level, I'm asking my investors to invest in an uncorrelated lottery ticket, and I'm telling them at some point this option is going to have a lot more value. So I'm a little bit from the other side I'm on the other side of the risk reward curve from David. David's looking for value and for delivering things as cost effectively as possible. And I'm looking for things that can be explosive. And I think the final thing to think about in healthcare, I think that COVID represents actually a huge change in the dynamic of thinking about healthcare, not so much because of the treatments for COVID per se, or how much it's on our mind, or maybe a little bit because of that, but it's changed the risk reward profile. Okay, so Darshana mentioned that we're spending 18% of our GDP on healthcare. I can see a world where that goes up to 30%, on the basis of, would you rather have another restaurant meal, or would you rather live an extra 3 years? And I think that the optionality and the value of options, I think COVID with having a standard, I took a vaccine, if I come down with COVID, given my age, I have a 1 in 500 or 1 in 1,000 chance of dying from COVID. But it's permeated everybody's consciousness, so that what was an acceptable level of failure in the past is no longer an acceptable level. And as that ripples through the rest of healthcare, I think that people are going to pay more for the optionality of healthcare success.
Darshana, you had mentioned a moment ago about there's a number of cash-laden companies who are looking to make acquisitions. Have you identified a lot of those, or are there firms that are all sort of known to us that you think are going after this market?
From an exit perspective, you mean the med tech companies? Yes, there's a whole sort of host of large med tech out there. The names are familiar to all of us. Boston Scientific, J&J, Medtronic, Abbott, Edwards. There's a whole host of companies. We've identified, I think, about 70 in the US and Europe that are actively have made an acquisition, or at least one acquisition in the last 5 years. And more importantly, they're sitting on a huge amount of cash reserves. So from our perspective, we are in constant touch with these folks. And we look at the universe of investments as, what are the technologies that are solving the biggest unmet needs? And we define the biggest unmet needs as, cardiac issues, oncology, pain, the diseases that cost a lot, that cost the healthcare system a lot of money. They're a big burden to the healthcare system, and where the strategic interest is the highest. So all of these med tech companies have a sales force that is used to selling into some of these clinical subspecialties. And so where we can find the right fit, and that happens to be predominantly in the cardiac and oncology space for us, where we have companies, exceptionally good technologies that are changing lives, improving lives, and where the medtech companies have a lot of interest. I realized I should give a couple of examples of sort of the types of companies that we've invested in, where, which sort of fit this description of mechanical solution for mechanical problem that I described earlier. One of the companies in our last portfolio that we ended up selling to Boston Scientific is a device to diagnose ovarian cancer early in women who are at high risk. So if you think about the market, there's about 600,000 women walking around in the US today, just in the US today, that are at high risk of developing ovarian cancer. And they know this because they have a family history, or they have the BRCA gene, or they have some sort of susceptibility that is known and that have a 70% lifetime risk of getting the cancer. And yet they have no way of being surveilled. So there's no sort of PSA type test that you have for prostate cancer or mammograms that you have for breast cancer. For ovarian cancer, there is really no effective tool to diagnose these women. But the issue is that the ovaries are in a part of the body that is inaccessible. It's not necessarily a problem of diagnosing once you have a sample of the ovaries. The problem is that the ovaries are hard to access. And so we looked at it as a mechanical problem. And this exceptionally good founder out of Silicon Valley had an idea for a catheter that can be used in the doctor's office. So in an outpatient setting, you don't need anesthesia or anything like that. That can go deep into the body and obtain a sample from the ovaries in a minimally invasive manner to diagnose cancer. And so this is like what we saw this as a pap smear test. So your pap smear for cervical cancer that is done, every year or every 3 years, depending on your risk factors. We see this as a test that can be administered to this group of high-risk women. And it's very simple because all you have to really do is get that sample. Once you get the sample, the test on it is a regular test that is done today. So you're not reinventing the wheel in terms of the actual testing modality. The real invention is in being able to get that sample. So that's the type of technology that we're interested in, where the unmet need is very, very high. These women are at risk of developing the cancer and dying within a few years, where these patients are already presenting to the OBGYN, so they're looking for a solution. All of the strategics, or many of the major strategics, have a sales channel into the OB's office. So we know that there are acquirers that are interested in technologies like this. And then where the science risk is pretty low, meaning that if you can develop or engineer this catheter, then the rest of the process, it already exists and can be, you can piggyback on it. And so that ended up being a really successful investment for us. We invested in it when there was not even a prototype. In fact, it was just a drawing on paper. And as Eric said earlier, the team here is so key. We had this one entrepreneur who could do so many different things, from engineering and proof of concept development all the way to regulatory and reimbursement. And then we ended up, within 5 years, developing the product, showing that it works in a clinical setting, and we sold the company to Boston Scientific. So that's sort of a flavor of what we're trying to do.
So we've got a couple quick questions. First one is from the healthcare, please quickly discuss, I'm just going to read the question. Please quickly discuss what happened in the 90s to capitalization initiatives, and if data analytics have created a reason for capitalization models to be considered again for physician practices. Is practice fear of revenue reduction under capitalization more significant than their desire to get out of insurance, paper push and burden, and back into patient care? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Nothing of great value.
My only I have one thought that's directly relates to it, one that's kind of indirect. I think on the capitation side, it's not so much that you've seen with CAR-T became, came out as like this. It was reported in the press breathlessly as this incredibly expensive drug, $500,000 a person, but they actually did their revenues based on success. So I think you're going to see a lot more success-based reimbursement. So the numbers are going to appear higher, but they're going to be limited to patients that have success on the oncology space. And then I think that we've gotten some mixed messages from the insurers as to how they'll be going forward, but I think the insurers are going to wind up with a greatly expanded number of people that they have to take care of. So I expect some dilution in the quality of care going forward.
Another question we have, and this is, I think all three of you could comment on this. what government regulatory changes should we expect from the new administration that will impact healthcare sectors? Any thoughts there?
Well, I'll volunteer a thought or two. I'm delighted to hear from my old friend Barry Hames, who's done a great job going back 30 years. I think that the Trump administration tried to put in a regulation with transparency. I actually anticipate that was a change that will not happen in the same way now. And the early moves by the Biden administration to avoid a decrease in the price of things like insulin suggest that what we're going to get in healthcare is perhaps less change than we anticipated from a regulatory point of view.
David
I,
or Donna?
I tend to think of sort of, the new administration as perhaps less change, but more certainty around what we're going to see. And so there was a lot of concern, I think, in the last administration, whether for good or for bad, what changes would be implemented. But I think from this government, what we at least expect to see is more consistency from prior administrations. So and I think from an investor standpoint, certainty is better than uncertainty. And so I think that from my perspective is a good thing, is that we're just, going to see more certainty in the rules that govern payment.
Yeah, I would just add that Joe Biden's been very involved with the accelerator, incubator, startup health. I believe his daughter is married to one of the founders, or the brother of one of the founders. He's been at their conferences, very involved in their moonshot projects, which I don't love that term, because moonshots, the only moonshot I know, the NASA one, which we just saw, I feel like with COVID, was everyone had basically one payer, which is the US government, or foreign countries had their own, where everyone was on the same side of the equation. But he lost his son to cancer. I would expect the FDA to continue to be more aggressive in approvals. So I hope that there. The other part, though, is that he's very into entrenched, like unions and things, that he's very into entrenched groups. So I think there's going to be a little bit of everything, some aggressive areas and some very conservative areas. So it's going to take a little time to see what they actually do.
That's interesting. So we've got a few more minutes here. For all of you, I guess the question is healthcare going through a decentralization movement? Finances. What does this look like going forward for you guys?
I mean, I'll give it 30-second. I think unequivocally, it's being decentralized. My kids are now turning roughly 16, 18, 20. And as far back as 5 years ago, we'd send a picture to the pediatrician of a rash, get on the phone, and now that's standard. We invested in a decentralized clinical trials company whose revenue was kind of limping along. And now it's, when I say exploding, I mean exploding, and they do a ton in cardiac care. The founder ran Edwards Life Sciences clinical trials for years. And everything is moving there. Some areas will resist, but I mean, that's been my whole bet. I mean, my bet 4 years ago, I was preaching anything that moves the point of care out to the patient will ultimately win. So patient signals, the Apple Watch, all these other tools actually start to matter. They were kind of very peripheral, but they're really going to matter. And we're looking at a remote patient monitoring company now that does acute care at home. And they're really taking nursing models, home nursing care, and accelerating it dramatically. So it's the cheapest way, it's the most efficient way. And again, Eric, what you were saying, I wasn't saying value. What I was saying is that the laws are demanding value-based care, proving your value, which will enable you to get paid in the first place and paid more if you prove value. So we're actually saying the same thing differently. But yeah, it's decentralized very much.
Eric or Deshaun?
Yeah, I think that I'm kind of delighted to see it. I think that there's a community, and once upon a time, the venture community was the sole arbiter of what things got to trial. I think, going back on the theme of optionality, I mean, there are, 1,000, 1,500 different trials going on worldwide in oncology, and not all of them are venture backed. So I think that there's much greater diversity of ideas starting out, although the traditional favored sons get by far the best financing and the best valuation. But I'm just delighted to see decentralization in the sense that there are a lot more options out there, and I think the internet has been a great leveler of the information disadvantage that used to exist.
Great. Darshana, you want to quickly add? I think the panel's coming to a close.
I agree with all
Got
that.
about 5 minutes, guys.
Okay, great. Darshana, I think we lost you for a moment.
Sorry, I said I had nothing to add. I agree. with
Oh,
all that.
okay. Okay.
Okay, can I add? I just want to add to the question, which is that I asked about decentralization. There's a decentralization movement, but also there's a fantastic improvement in data collection. And I think Dave was getting at, remote collection of information from the patient on a daily basis, right? So maybe you guys can talk a little bit more about that, and what's the role of data in all this? And I don't want to get into the AI part, because I think David's right about overinvestment in that, but just, in terms of the data collection, the trends, et cetera.
I think, I can just give a very short 15, 30-second answer to that from our perspective. Data is great, but what do you do with data? And I think that's really the question that we have to kind of address in the next few years. Is there's a lot of data being collected by our Apple Watch, and there's a lot of data being collected by the ring that you wear, and all kinds of technologies. But who's reading that data, and how do you make meaning out of it? And how do you get doctors and nurses and care providers who are already burdened with sort of all of their daily tasks and all of their daily case management loads to focus on all of this massive amount of data that is coming out of all these technologies. And so I think that's where the new challenge is, and perhaps AI plays a role there. But I think that is, I haven't seen very good answers to how do you catch that one isolated, troubling incident out of a massive plethora of data that you're getting out of your iPhone. So it's just, I look at sort of heart, a heart rate, and you're walking on the road, you step onto a crosswalk, and a car comes by, and suddenly your heart rate shoots up, right? How do you manage those types of anomalies, which are perfectly understandable in the normal course of day, and how do you factor those in when you're trying to identify real issues with the patient? And so maybe somebody else has a better answer than I do, but we haven't made too many investments in AI or data management, but that's really the question that I struggle with.
David or Eric?
I would argue that's the low-hanging fruit of AI. That's not difficult to do, but it's who's going to do it. I just got approached by 2 different decision support system companies in the same week. This is about a month ago, actually 2 months ago at this point, both looking to just be a simple add-on for doctors' offices, that when you take all the patient signals and dump them in, and those patient signals could be blood pressure in the office, but what is the next question to ask, the next decision to make? And then there's the nascent, still very early area of digital twins, which will really start to matter, I think, in the next year or two. And that's tracking people both in real time and then running scenarios out based on what they're seeing. And that can include everything off your Apple Watch to your blood work to anything else that, it will eventually include liquid biopsy information, everything. And then you'll be able to track inflammatory markers and say, okay, this person their cancer is getting worse, without waiting for that fearful month or quarter check-in, et cetera. So that stuff's happening in real time. And I think you'll see companies leap forward. It'll take a while, but then they'll suddenly leap forward once they reach a certain quality.
I'm excited by the opportunities of data, and I'm also scared by the threat of data. So this is kind of a philosophical point, but my wife's Estonian, and in Estonia, when you're over 75 and you need treatment of some kind, they hand you an aspirin and say good luck. There's a downside to data as well. So I hope. I hope data fulfills its promise, but I hope it's not. I hope it's not too much of a two-edged sword.
So I just want to jump in here again. I just have three cases I want to talk about. One is I think that by different people who are different ages and you collect the data, or different ethnicities respond to medicine differently. And so there's some guy on radio every weekend who's a doctor, is talking about all the different medical care and how it's terrible. I'm not even sure if he's a real doctor, but one point he did bring up is that half the people that take high blood pressure medicine, for example, get massive cramping and they quit within a year of taking the medicine, right? So maybe there's some better data on that, or people who are different ages. But when we were in San Diego, it must have been 4 or 5 years ago, we were looking at a lot of devices, and the data sharing for performance. So I'm not talking about people who are sick, but people who are like in running groups and they want to train better. That data sharing is really, all the VCs in San Diego are working on this kind of stuff. People who are training for stuff, how do they maximize, optimize it, et cetera. I think it's really interesting when it's not a sick care, but it's more of a wellness, sort of thing. So it's real fascinating stuff. Are there any more questions, Dan? I have time for one more question, then we're going to jump to the other panel.
The question real quick is, did you guys look at the focus on tech and devices versus in outside the US, or are you focused primarily in this market? So are you looking at markets like South America, other markets, as well as the US? Real quick.
From a purely investment standpoint, we are highly US focused. So we have not yet done an investment outside of the United States, although we actively look at companies out of Israel and Ireland, which we identify as the two outside of the US, two hotspots for medtech innovation. But from a clinical trial standpoint, we're in South America, we're in Eastern Europe. All of our companies are doing clinical trials in various geographies. And then finally, from a markets perspective, it's the whole world, really. Japan, Europe, and US are all markets for our technologies, and so are China and increasingly South America and other parts of Asia. But purely from an investment standpoint, we're very, very focused on the US.
Yeah, we're focused on worldwide. We actually, one of our largest investors is Korean and is very eager to see our companies in Korea. I would just add that I mentioned earlier that I'm looking for deals that have a chance to cut things short or have explosive upsides. One of the markets that you always have to think about in the therapeutic area is, can you give this drug to a pet? Our periodontal drug, it turns out, may wind up being almost as big in the dog market as it is in the human market, and it may preclude the need for any additional funding for the human market. So I would encourage people to think outside the box in terms of markets, not just Korea or overseas, but don't be speciest. Look at the non-human markets.
Yeah, we're primarily US, look a lot in Israel. I'd say there's no country in the world that produces companies that are more productive with capital than Israel, and then a little bit in Europe. But the vast majority is US, and even the Israeli companies have to do business in the US.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Marty, turn it back to you.
Fantastic. Again,
Dan, thank you very much.
Folks. Great job. And so again, there may be a few more healthcare questions that are on the chat, so you might want to just answer them directly via chat. Again, if you're a speaker on the last panel, feel free to introduce yourself to the group via chat, talk about what you do, what you're looking for, et cetera. People want to make use of everybody else. So,
Thank you.
Great
so,
discussion, guys.
so yeah. So our next